Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Users Did What? I'm Yael Mark, a product consultant who helps teams turn messy user behavior into smart product decisions. This podcast is where we dig into those moments when user behavior flips our assumptions on their head and forces us to rethink not just what we build, but how we build it. Today, I'm joined by Michelle Manne, a product leader who specializes in strategy, go-to-market, and operational transformation for experience-driven software. She spent nearly a decade helping building and scale products at care.com, and more recently has been focused on the healthcare space where she's been launching new SaaS offerings for life science companies. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad that you're here. I'm very intrigued to see how this conversation will go. I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot from you. Let's rewind to those early COVID days. We all remember those. You were building a caregiver marketplace when suddenly everything changed. What became the biggest barrier for people trying to find each other at that time?
Everything was shifted on its head. Nobody knew what was going to happen. What our platform does is help families find care for their loved ones and help caregivers find jobs. And at this time, the biggest barrier was uncertainty. Families needed care to start returning to work, but no one knew what reasonable expectations look like, what safety looked like. The question wasn't just, can I find someone, but how can I trust that this person isn't putting me at undue risk? The shift made health and healthcare more central to the decision than it had ever been before. Safety has always been a factor in, is this person right for my family? But this created an intersection between safety and healthcare.
This example just shows how quickly the context of use and the context of decision making can shift and impact how people eventually act. A flow that made sense a week ago can be completely unsafe the next. And it's a reminder that our product is not just created in a vacuum, it lives in the real world. And we couldn't just predict a worldwide pandemic, but as product managers, we must consider the cases where things don't go as planned, right? Design in advance for those we can predict and be flexible enough for those we can't. What solutions were on the table once the pandemic hit? And how did you decide which ones would matter beyond the pandemic versus those that were just like a short-term fixes?
Great question. The really at any given time, a product leader's responsibility is, how do I take in new opportunities while still maintaining course on the initiatives that we've already set out to achieve our goals? There was just so much new data flooding in, and there were a lot of things at the table. We were looking at pods. People wanted to create learning pods. Homeschooling was blowing up in a way that obviously had never done before. Ways for families to connect directly. All of this was on the table. We even tested a bit whether people wanted to do more self-organizing, connecting family to family. When we really dug into the data and listened to what our families were asking for, and also our caregivers, it helped us identify how not to spread ourselves too thin. I don't remember the percentage exactly, but a very small percentage of inquiries was podding and homeschooling. It was definitely a big uptick, but is that something that was going to have longevity? We used the data and what we were hearing from families to say, hey, we'll facilitate some connection up front, but we're not going to invest in a long-term solution on pods and homeschooling. Instead, we're going to focus on what we do best, which is surfacing relevant signals to families and caregivers of what might precipitate a good match. And so one of the things that we was really successful was a vaccination status that we allowed caregivers and families to indicate on their profiles. Just a signal to carry forward how people could think about trust and compatibility when evaluating, match.
So you're saying in a way, the pandemics helped you figure out and sort of cleared out those short-term solutions, as you said, like pods, the things that everybody were trying to do, but it's not your core business. Your core business is about the matching process. It's really cool that something that is supposed to shake everything around gave you clarity about that.
I was just going to say, I think it helped us reinforce some of our core competencies. Also, if money were no object, of course, we would have built out a way to connect families to potting solutions and homeschooling and facilitated that on their behalf. But that's never the case for any product leader. So it does have to come down to what's the biggest opportunity that we can execute on, both for within budget, but also within a timely fashion, because we didn't even know, is a COVID vaccination status going to be something someone cares about more than a few months? But it also was a lower maintenance opportunity to from an implementation standpoint. It didn't cost us a lot because we already had a framework of allowing families and caregivers to signal their most their most critical attributes.
One of the greatest challenges working in a marketplace platform is that matching is really all about trust. And as you mentioned, once the pandemic hit, trust was a big issue and everything became much more sensitive. So can you drive us through your process of finding the specific data point? You mentioned that it was an easy to implement. Were there other data points you were considering back then?
So we were analyzing all the information that we were getting. We listened to families. What were they asking caregivers? So our messaging is a key facet of our platform. We analyzed message data and trends of what are they talking about, what are they looking for, what are they posting jobs looking for, what are the titles of the job descriptions that they're trying to find, and seeing, okay, homeschooling teacher, that's obviously a need. How often is that coming up? What we did was we both talked to our customers, hearing what their fears and concerns were, how to marry that with the data that we were seeing. We figured out what are the things that we can standardize in the product so trust isn't abstract, and how can we help facilitate coming some of those signals that could actually be difficult to talk through. Because one of the things we heard from families and caregivers is that it's a touchy subject to ask someone if they have been vaccinated or what they're doing to protect themselves. It really bridges into a very personal conversation, but one that's very relevant for someone who's going to be taking care of a member of your family. So we really try to come up with ways that could put those topics front and center in a way that made the conversation easier.
What's fascinating about it is that not all trust signals are equal. Some build confidence, others create friction, on the other hand. And like too much emphasis on background checks, for example, can make the experience feel bureaucratic instead of safe. But also, too much data can be overwhelming. So, how do you create a sense of safety without overloading users with check steps or hoops to jump through?
The short answer is you absolutely have to test into it over time. One of the benefits we had is that trust and safety has always been a cornerstone of finding care, right? So we had already been testing, which types of attributes are the most useful for facilitating a match on the platform. I would say overall for product, it's about reducing friction with UX and information hierarchy. So all of that information might be needed, but when is the right time to surface it is something you have to test. And I'm a really big advocate of marrying both, flow testing with prototype user testing is a huge way to just hear and see how people think about what they're doing as they go through it. And you marry that with A/B tests in the product itself.
I could not agree more about understanding what is the flow, what is the right order to show the information, what kind of information they want to see now because they have a certain anxiety or fear sort of popped in their mind. And if they have the answer right away because you predicted how it will go, it actually gives them a really nice reassurance of using the product and understanding that this product understands them. Analyzing how people using your product and how it all comes down to which steps they're taking one after another, and considering also the context in which they're living is always a key to succeed and find out what is the right design. Did it work? I haven't asked.
I would say that the vaccination status specifically was definitely one of the most successful implementations we had made in the space for the a preceding couple of years. In terms of what worked, how you would define that. I would define that as families felt like they were getting critical information that they needed to make hiring decisions. And we did see people coming back and using the platform in a way that we weren't sure they would during this time period. And so I definitely would say it was successful. And I haven't even checked if it's still an attribute on the platform, but it was an attribute on the platform for a number of years, which to me, based on the level of investment that it took to implement it, is a huge success. We were able to implement something quickly that had real tangible meaning to our families. Myself as a parent, that was critical. I had to hire an in-home nanny to help facilitate online kindergarten for my kindergartner during the end of
Uh-huh.
the pandemic. And then after school care, having an in-home caregiver once they went back, I needed to know that this person was vaccinated, and it was something that I could use to filter applications up front. If they weren't vaccinated, I would not consider that for my family in particular. And I think the important thing is that we weren't creating a requirement, we were creating a signal, and then families and caregivers could decide what works for them and what's important to them.
Wow. First of all, nothing like to be a user of your own product. Always a good way to find out new things you haven't considered before. And the balance is just so tricky that we have to aim to show just enough at the right moment and test it out if we can, of course, which lead me to right to the next question. When building marketplaces, there's a fine line between giving users enough information to make a safe choice and putting all the responsibility on them. How do you decide where that line is?
So our philosophy had always been that our role is to enable transparency without dictating behaviors. We guide families and caregivers with best practices and the right tools to identify people that they may match with, but always set the expectation that you need to do your own due diligence. And more so, people prefer this. They want to be a part of that process. It's the IKEA effect. And I recently started using this junk elephant product, a vitamin C cream. And when you get it, it's, first of all, the packaging is gorgeous, great marketing, great packaging. But you actually assemble the serum yourself. You mix it yourself. And you do feel this sense of, wow, this is like high quality. I feel good about the premium price of this product because one, it works, but two, you feel like you're doing something to contribute. So there's that superficial aspect of it, but from a deeper perspective, anytime you're making such a critical decision for your family, you have to do deep vetting yourself that this person has been, background checked and that they do meet your criteria and expectations through various mechanisms. The role that we played was to arm families and caregivers with the tools to make that possible.
Amen to that. We all looking for solutions to make our life easier, right? We hear those notes of users are lazy everywhere, but in many cases, we do want to have at least the last decision to make in our own, after our own analysis, to have a sense of control. If you give users too much responsibility, the platform feels like it's a stepping back. But if you take too much control, users feel infantilized or just incompetent. And trust isn't just a feature to integrate in your marketplace or product in general. It's a shared agreement between the platform and the community. It's so critical to understand where responsibility lies across the entire flow and identify which steps you could let your users delegate to your platform, and which steps they should keep as their own. Before we wrap up, I wanted to point out the trust scales when it's distributed. If users feel like they're part of the ecosystem and not just the customers of it, they can help enforce some norms, spot bad actors, and reinforce good behavior. To your point, might be all related to the IKEA effect, or just like a sense of ownership and a sense of belonging in the community and want to keep it safe. That's when marketplace becomes sustainable. For PMs who are building marketplaces, what your advice for cultivating a sense of ownership so the community help maintain trust, not just the platform?
First, you're so right. Platforms cannot hold all the trust themselves. The community has to reinforce it. This is a tricky question. I know it sounds over simplistic, but it boils down to what is in it for the users and how can you make sure that they understand the value that their input is providing. So for our platform, for families, it's about paying it forward. If you have a caregiver, that you want them to be successful if they're really amazing, and so you want to provide that feedback for them. In the inverse is of course also true. For caregivers, it's reputation. The more signals of reliability that they share, the better their chance of getting hired. So shared ownership comes when building benefits everyone, and that there's an understanding of why that is valuable. And I think marketplaces struggle with it. There are aspects we struggled with all the time. And we had a really hard time getting providers to keep their availability up to date, for example. And so there's always going to be challenges, but it really comes down to how do you show the value of what their contributions are going to have to others and to themselves.
It always comes back to understanding the value, saying it in a clear way, and to reflect that in the product itself. And always, just always think about the goal, the end goal of the users. Michelle, thank you so much for walking us through this story. I think my biggest takeaway, there's many. One of them is that trust isn't built in one feature. Trust is built in hundreds of little signals and decisions and moments that make people feel safe to engage and safe to be part of this community. And in a marketplace, a product isn't just a platform, it's the relationships it's enabled between the providers and the seekers. Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening to Users Did What? See you next week.